Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today we're going way back into the archives for a story that you might not have heard of, but you'll definitely want to hear more about after we're done here.
Oh, yeah. This one's got it all. Like, you won't believe what this guy got up to.
So we're talking about James Edward Daniels,
A name you probably haven't heard before.
but trust me, his life is like a true crime novel come to life.
Absolutely. We're talking murder, parole, reinvention, and then a final act that's just unbelievable.
And to guide us on this journey, we're going to be using a Wikipedia article as our source material.
Yeah, and as anyone who's ever gone down a Wikipedia rabbit hole knows, you can find some seriously fascinating stuff in there.
So just to set the stage, Daniels' life spans from 1940 to 1984.
Primarily in New York and New Jersey.
But there's a twist.
A surprising detour to Oregon along the way.
Oh, yeah. We're going to
Oh.
get to that Oregon part. It's a wild ride.
Buckle up.
So let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
What do we know about Daniels' early life?
Well, the Wikipedia article mentions he was born in Brooklyn in 1940, but then the information gets a little scarce.
Yeah, it jumps right to a 1960 assault charge.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot to go on.
True. It's not uncommon for records from that era to be a bit spotty, especially for people who, ended up on the wrong side of the law.
But what we do see, even from these limited early records, is this pattern of escalating violence.
Right. That 1960 assault charge, it involved a zip gun.
So already at a young age, we see a willingness to resort to force.
Exacto.
And sadly, that willingness to use force ultimately leads to a tragedy in 1963. Daniels is involved in a murder,
The victim was a man named Calvin Dean.
and it happened during a craps game.
Yeah, apparently some kind of dispute over money escalated, and Daniels ended up shooting Dean.
This murder lands him a hefty sentence, 50 years to life.
Which back then was basically a life sentence.
So at this point, you have to wonder what was going through his mind. How did he end up on this path?
Well, we can only speculate, but it's a question that's always intriguing, right? What leads a person to commit such a serious crime? Was it a one-time thing? Or were there signs, red flags, earlier in his life?
Yeah, it really makes you think about the nature versus nurture debate.
Absolutely.
Now Daniels finds himself in Greenhaven Correctional Facility.
One of New York's toughest prisons.
But here's where things start to get really interesting. He doesn't just sit around and waste away. He actually tries to make something of himself.
He learns to be a barber, plays on the prison football team, even takes some college courses.
Almost like he's trying to turn his life around.
Right. And that always raises the question, was it genuine rehabilitation? Or was it all a calculated act? A way to manipulate the system and maybe get an early release.
Because you have to remember, he's still serving a 50 years to life sentence.
Exactly. And he knows that any chance of freedom depends on convincing the parole board that he's a changed man.
Now, there's one detail in the article that I found particularly intriguing. It mentions Daniel's connection to some volunteers from SUY New Paltz, a college in upstate New York.
Interesting.
And get this, some of these volunteers were actually from Oregon.
Now that's interesting. Could that be a clue about his future plans?
It's like planting a seed, isn't it?
It's like he's laying the groundwork for a new life outside of New York.
And that new life becomes a reality in 1976, when Daniels is granted parole.
After serving only 13 years of his sentence.
Now, the article says this early parole was made possible because of changes in New York sentencing laws at the time.
Yeah, the 1970s saw a big shift in how many states approached sentencing. There was this growing focus on rehabilitation and concerns about prison overcrowding.
So they started giving people a chance to re-enter society sooner.
Exactly. And in Daniel's case, this change in the law becomes a major turning point.
It opens the door for him to start a new life far away from the scene of his crime.
All the way out in Oregon.
That's right.
And that's where things get really interesting.
We'll talk about what happens next after a quick break.
So Daniels heads out to Oregon and starts building a new life for himself.
He gets married,
Yeah.
has a kid, even lands a job as an aide at a detox facility.
It's like a complete 180, right?
It really is. On the surface, it looks like he's turned over a new leaf. He's a family man, a working man, a contributing member of society.
But there's a detail in the article that I found a little unsettling.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
This detox facility where Daniels was working, they didn't run background checks.
Wait, seriously? They just hired him without knowing anything about his past.
Apparently so.
That's unbelievable, especially given his history.
Right. I mean, you'd think a place that deals with addiction and recovery would be a little more careful about who they hire.
It's almost like this new life he's built is resting on a very shaky foundation.
Exactly. And it doesn't take long for that foundation to start crumbling.
Because not long after starting this new life, Daniels gets accused of theft.
Yeah, and not just any theft. The article says he was suspected of stealing from a police evidence locker.
Whoa, that's a bold move.
Right, and to catch him in the act, the police set up a sting operation.
Did it work?
Well, sort of. They caught him with stolen goods, but the case went to trial twice, and both times ended in a mistrial.
A mistrial. What happened?
The details are a bit murky, but it seems like there were some issues with the evidence or maybe the way the sting operation was conducted.
So he walked free.
Yep, twice.
Man, talk about dodging a bullet.
Right. But even though he wasn't convicted, these accusations and trials had a profound impact on Daniels.
How so?
Well, imagine you're trying to put your past behind you, you're trying to build a new life, and then bam, you're accused of a crime, dragged through the mud, even though you're ultimately not found guilty.
That's got to be demoralizing.
Absolutely. It's
What?
like the system that gave him a second chance is now turning against him.
And that's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly,
Right.
because it fuels this resentment, this anger, this feeling that he can't catch a break.
And unfortunately, that anger and resentment manifest in a horrific way just a few years later.
In 1984, the body of a man named Ira Adams is found in a stolen U-Haul truck.
And to make matters even worse, Adam's girlfriend, Karen Jefferson, is also found murdered.
It's a brutal double homicide.
And the evidence quickly points to James Edward Daniels.
They found a note with an address that led them straight to Jefferson's body.
So he's on the run now, a fugitive wanted for double murder.
Yep. And the article suggests that these murders weren't random acts of violence. They were connected to some kind of burglary ring that Daniels and Adams were both involved in.
So it sounds like a dispute over money, maybe a falling out among thieves.
That's the likely scenario. It's a grim reminder that even in the criminal underworld, trust and loyalty can be fleeting.
So what happens next? Where does Daniels go?
He goes into hiding, trying to stay one step ahead of the law.
But his luck is about to run out in a very dramatic way.
On May 7, 1984, Daniels and a friend of his, Bezalel Hutchinson, are driving along the New Jersey Turnpike when they get pulled over by a state trooper.
Trooper Carlos Negron.
A routine traffic stop, or so Trooper Negron thought.
Little did he know who he was dealing with.
It's a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Because instead of surrendering or trying to talk their way out, Daniels and Hutchinson decide to make a run for it.
They open fire on Trooper Negron, fatally wounding him.
It's a senseless act of violence that ends the life of a young officer who was just doing his job.
And it sets off a chain reaction of events that will ultimately lead to Daniels' demise.
What happens after the shooting?
Well, Daniels and Hutchinson flee the scene in their van.
But they know the police are on their tail.
So they ditch the van and run into the woods, desperately trying to escape,
They end up at a service center in Hightstown, New Jersey.
where they take the employees hostage, tie them up, and steal a company van.
They're not just running anymore. They're actively putting more lives in danger.
It's a desperate last-ditch effort to avoid capture,
And it leads to a high-speed chase through the streets of New Jersey.
with state troopers and local police in hot pursuit,
It's like something out of a movie.
except the stakes are all too real.
So how does this chase end?
Not well. The stolen van, driven at a reckless speed, loses control and crashes into a utility pole.
And that's the end for Daniels.
It is. The crash is fatal, both for him and for Hutchinson.
Wow. What a way to go out.
Yeah, it's a chaotic and violent end to a life that was full of chaos and violence.
But there's one final detail in this story that I found particularly chilling.
The fact that Daniels, Hutchinson, and Trooper Negron all died at the same hospital within a short time of each other.
It's almost too strange to be true.
Right, like some kind of cosmic coincidence.
It's like their fates were intertwined in this web of tragedy.
It really makes you think about the ripple effects of our actions, how one bad decision can lead to a cascade of unintended consequences.
Now, in the aftermath of the crash, investigators searched Daniels' van and found some interesting items.
Ammunition, a survival manual.
And a letter addressed to someone named Daruba.
This letter sparked quite a bit of intrigue because it contained a rather cryptic message.
What did it say?
It said, Asada is fine and sends her regards. Asada Shakur.
Oh, wow. The Black Liberation Army fugitive?
The one and only.
So was Daniels connected to Assata Shakur?
That's what everyone wanted to know at the time. The possibility that a convicted murderer who had just killed another state trooper might have ties to a notorious fugitive like Shakur was a bombshell.
It's like something out of a conspiracy thriller.
Right. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation, but ultimately they concluded that the letter in Daniels' van didn't actually belong to him.
So it was a dead end.
Yeah. It seems the letter belonged to his former cellmate, Anna Chetaruba, who is also associated with the Black Liberation Army.
So a fascinating lead that ultimately didn't pan out.
But even without the Shakur connection, Daniel's story is full of twists and turns.
It's a story that raises a lot of questions about the criminal justice system, the complexities of rehabilitation, the choices we make that shape our destinies.
And the lasting consequences of those choices.
It really is a reminder that actions have consequences.
Yeah, no matter how far you run or how hard you try to escape your past, it always seems to catch up in the end.
It's kind of poetic in a way.
It is, and tragic, of course. We can't forget the victims in all of this.
Absolutely. Trooper Negrin, a young officer with his whole life ahead of him, cut down in the line of duty.
And Ira Adams and Karen Jefferson, their lives taken too soon, caught up in this web of crime and violence.
It's a sobering thought. And speaking of Trooper Negron, the article does mention his funeral.
Yeah, Trooper Negron was laid to rest with full honors, a true hero.
His death really shook the law enforcement community.
Absolutely. It led to calls for increased police presence on the highways and a renewed focus on officer safety.
It's a stark reminder of the risks these men and women face every day to keep us safe.
And the sacrifices they make.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of James Edward Daniels, I'm left with this feeling of sadness, but also a sense of wonder.
Wonder about what?
About the choices we make in life, the paths we choose,
Yeah.
the consequences that follow.
Yeah, Daniel's story is a powerful example of that, isn't it?
He had a chance to turn his life around after prison. He seemed to be doing well in Oregon. But then something happened. Something snapped.
We may never know for sure what pushed him back over the edge, but it's a reminder that the past is always with us.
And that even when we try to escape it, it can still have a hold on us.
It's a complex issue, right? Rehabilitation, redemption, second chances. These are all things we as a society need to keep grappling with.
Absolutely. So what are your final thoughts for our listeners today?
Well, I'd say that Daniel's story is a cautionary tale, but it's also a story about the human capacity for both good and evil.
It's a story that challenges us to think about the choices we make and the impact those choices have on ourselves and the world around us.
And it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope for redemption.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life of James Edward Daniels.
It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey. And as always, we encourage you to do your own research and come to your own conclusions.
Until next time, stay curious.